Monday. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 690th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, the Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Fox Hysen and Tom McGlynn. We're thrilled to welcome poet Tatiana Borie here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land that we're speaking from. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. Painter Fox Hysen was born in San Rafael, California, and grew up in the Bay Area. She received her BFA from New York University in 2006 and her MFA from Yale University in 2015. She lives in Norfolk, Connecticut, where she also runs an artist residency called Greenwoods 2058. Solo exhibitions include Soloway Gallery in Brooklyn, Gallery 16 in San Francisco, the Suburban in Milwaukee, and Marvelli Gallery in New York. She was also the recipient of the 2022 Pollock Krasner Fellowship, the 2016 Tournesol Award for Painting by the Headlands Center for the Arts, and is the 2022 Frederick Hammersley Visiting Artist. She's currently faculty at Boston University. An artist, writer, and independent curator, Tom McGlynn, is based in New York. His work is represented in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum of the Smithsonian. He's currently an adjunct professor at Parsons School of Design, the New School. Tom has a solo exhibition at Rick Wester Fine Art in New York in April 2023 and is an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Tom McGlynn.
Thank you, Chloe. And it's my pleasure to be talking with Fox today.
My pleasure to be talking with you.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure. I'd like to start off with a quote by my mutual colleague, Joan Waltermuth, who's also editor-at-large emeritus, I guess you would say, at the Rail, because I think it kind of can shape our conversation in a way I think that your work implies, Fox. So Joan Waltermuth writes, how did we come to the place where form is equal to the absence of content? Resisting contemporary art's forgetting of how the medium undergirds the very possibility of art. I want to return to the newfold idea of medium specificity. And so, starting with this first watercolor, Fox, maybe you can talk about this piece in context of that.
Yeah, I should say that what Tom is quoting from, only that first part Joan said, that came from a conversation I wrote 4 essays. I gave 4 lectures at MICA last summer, and the last essay had to do with medium specificity. And so, we were talking about like, what is, this problem of formalism and how formalism really kind of ruined it for form. And the sort of way, and so like, and I think at one point I just asked her like what she thought the difference was between form and formalism. And in an email conversation back and forth, she said to me, what I really think you're asking is how we got to the place where form is equal to the absence of content. And that's sort of what I wrote about. The next quote is from Rosalind Krauss, who's, kind of obsessed with medium specificity and like won't let it go and like won't let us go into content. And she's just like keeps trying to come up with new models to get us back towards medium specificity. That's from Under Blue Cup. And then yeah, I think that the third part is mine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that's a great triumvirate there.
Yeah. And I'm glad.
I'm sorry. No, you go ahead.
I'm glad to start with these watercolors because I've been making watercolors for so long, and I have, sometimes I'll find a really old one and I'm like, wow, I was making watercolors like, 15 years ago. And I like never really took it seriously as part of my practice. It's like I just kept doing it. And then I make the watercolors and then I cut them up, or usually rip them up. I don't often use scissors, and then put them back together. And it's like, there's so, and then the idea is always like that I'm going to make the painting out of them, right? Or that these are just studies. But like, I guess in the last 2 years or so, I've been taking them more seriously. And I'm always moving around. And so it's the one thing I can just put in my bag. I can put the watercolors in my bag. I love to paint outside, and because I love landscape. I'm from California. And so I think like kind of what I'm doing is making landscape painting still. And I know, Tom, you relate to this too. It's like, and landscape is a constructed thing. It's not, I don't mean it in the sort of like natural sense. I mean, including buildings and whatnot. And also just the sort of the breakages of that. I mean, you might go outside for a minute and then, look at something, have an experience for a minute. And so these watercolors kind of hold that transience and that quickness and the kind of directness that I like in landscape. So I mostly am making watercolors all the time. And then I do still try to get back to my studio and make oil paintings, but that happens, less and less.
Can we just go back to the watercolor? The first one, Chloe, thank you. So I should tell everybody that Fox and I had a previous conversation that clarified a few things, and we talked about watercolors, we talked about Cézanne's watercolors, and I started to ruminate on the whole idea of like watercolors as a medium, speaking of media specificity. So I think it's probably one of those mediums where experience unfolds as emergent form. And it's interesting that sometimes in the past it's kind of characterized as kind of like a lightweight medium, like maybe a hobbyist medium.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really anything but, because it's like it decidedly embraces the density of the experience, even though it's a very kind of fluid form. It's so immediate.
Yeah, and it absorbs immediately into the paper, which is amazing. And if you get the right paper and the right watercolors, you can kind of really load up a lot of watercolor onto the paper. And the other cool thing is you can actually then, if things are going badly, I find that you can wash the watercolor back off, revealing previous layers. So you can, really get really material with it. I find it actually very forgiving in that sense, and I think most people find it very unforgiving. But what I love about it more than anything is it's really this record of time. Like more than anything, it's like the way that you have to stay with it and be in time with it, I just find to be the most pleasurable thing in the world. And really, that's kind of what I want out of art. It's like, I want just a sort of moment in time, the sort of, the direct experience. And I guess that goes back to a conversation about formalism, which formalism really talked about wanting this direct experience. But I think the problem with it is it somehow wanted that like outside of life, outside of God, outside of nature and landscape. And so I think, it's like formalism is great, and it is about God, and it is about nature, and it is about life. It's about all of those things. I mean, you kind of can't separate them out. And I think what I love about form also, and working this way, is it kind of holds, you get to a different kind of content that way. You just don't start with the content. You kind of reveal yourself, because you kind of find out that you can't really escape yourself anyway. Like, you don't really have to invent yourself. You're kind of there, despite your best efforts to kind of like, disappear. And I find the way that you kind of leak out and wobble, and the hand wobbles and all of those things to be kind of like, those gestures to be very meaningful.
Yeah, the time, time is very hard to describe, but the great thing about art is it creates temporal structures.
Yeah.
Like time itself doesn't really have a structure.
Right.
We can't really say what that is, right? But we can address it by creating temporal structures within time.
Yeah.
And so watercolor is like, it's this incredible medium in that regard. It has a light touch on time.
It totally does. Yeah. Which is why I called my show Schedules, because I thought that was, we are constantly thinking about time in terms of like, I guess our, what we have to do during the day. But I think that there's other things that structure, that's the word that we used for structuring time. And so these are kind of other ways of structuring time.
Right. You're talking about time as habit, kind of.
Yeah. Or just the amount of time something takes to absorb into the paper, or
right,
for the leaves to fall off the trees. And, I live out in the country now. And so I'm constantly experiencing change all the time, like a tree is like this like, every time I look out the window, it's like, it's so incredibly different. And I'm just always kind of mystified and impressed with that.
You have that in your essay, the same essay, you have that great quote by Agnes Martin about the innocence of trees.
Yeah.
Something about the innocence of trees. I think she's talking about her work, or her the mindset she has to get to make her work.
Yeah.
And she also used very definitive grid structures, like this particular. I know you're not wedded to the grid, but in this particular watercolor, I wrote a while back a review of Otto Peine's work, and he uses a lot of grid structures too. And one of his early autobiographical experiences was, believe it or not, like mapping the night sky to send flak up to the bombers when he was like in the German army, So his experience of the night sky wasn't necessarily, it was experiential. The grid wasn't abstract for him. Right. It had a function. It had a mapping function.
Mm-hmm.
But so this relates to structure and memory too. Something about the memory of that really stuck with him, and it became like a recurring structure in his work.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see it on the piece on the right here too, where it looks like you cut up a watercolor and you stuck it on to another watercolor.
Yeah, that's about 3 different ones that ended up as one piece. I think there was 3, and they became mixed up with each other.
One of the things we also talked about was bridging and translation. So I'm wondering how the immediacy of the watercolors get translated into your oil paintings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is like, it's like this painting, it's like, I think in the watercolors that we were just looking at, which are like, they're up in my studio right now, they're very new. I think I've let go more of needing to look directly at things, because I'm very much like an observational painter. I mean, I've painted landscape quite a bit as well. But, and for a while, there's some other images here that are sort of, I mean, this painting, for example, is like, I was looking at a flower outside. So I was like, really like thinking about the shapes. And and that last one, of course, it's like a picture of my arm, and I'm using the miter saw there. So it's like I'm thinking about how you get that life in, and like I still maybe haven't figured out how you translate the watercolors into oil paint, but maybe the initial translation that I'm thinking about is how you translate the outside world into some kind of structured language. I started using the grid initially, actually, as a result of being in a Persian painting, Persian poetry and painting class, because Persian paintings are structured that way, where there's like these multiple events that happen in the same frame. And so there's this thing of simultaneity that happens. And I became really interested in how, you know, that was just like, you're so used to seeing one point perspective all of the time. And I thought, well, that's the simplest way out of it is that, you know, you can have things that happen in multiple places in one picture. And that sort of got me sort of moving things around the picture more easily. And these two paintings are of my driveway that I see out my window. But again, it's like I'm interested in the sort of like vision or the observation of this driveway, the perspective of that, but then also the translation of that into this flat space of the painting. And that negotiation is just something that I've been trying to figure out. I told you before we started talking that I wanted to talk about building, because I do a lot of building in my house. And you were saying that you did this too, like that I have a lot of need to do little construction projects all the time. Like I build a table, or I just redid the hearth in my house, or I've taken out walls, rebuilt things. I've done a lot of renovating of my own house. And there's so much sort of that's done so much out of necessity. But in the end, you're sort of that necessity, it's really satisfying. It's like, and so much of yourself is revealed in that. And so I think this, just this problem of how you make something that has a lot of depth, how do you get it to keep that depth, but also sort of like end up acknowledging the space of the picture plane, that flat sort of upright space. Like you were talking about Cezanne, just that classic problem of turning the tables up. And so that's been a sort of negotiation that I've been really interested in, just ideas of composition and perspective and things like that.
And so you're talking about also translating muscle memory, or, you know, the phenomenological, not just optical way of assimilating information. It's not, right. It's not merely optical. So, you know, if the artist creates these temporal structures in time, they're part of time, but they're also separate. So they are a translation of time.
Yeah, I love
that. When I look at this image, I do think of Diebenkorn, and I know that's somebody who has come up before, I think, in reference to your work, but also Matisse. And I think that Diebenkorn was trying to make a translation from the figurative to the abstract via Matisse. But I don't think Matisse was necessarily really involved in that. Like, I think Matisse had more of a continuity of vision. I think there's a difference between your work and Diebenkorn's in that regard.
Yeah, you know, I think it's, and maybe I move around because it's like the other thing is when I'm painting, I feel like I'm always trying to learn something new. You know, I've less sort of like set out to accomplish something, and then I have a new idea about something that I'm like trying to figure out. And so there is this thing about trying to figure out how to translate something out there in the world into a painting in a particular way, like in the Diebenkorn way of kind of make this, you know, the Ocean Park series, which are then made very frontal and flat. but something that interests me more and more is the sort of like Mondrian kind of model of like, you have like the space of a picture, and then that thing sort of generates, like you're saying, a certain phenomenology or a certain rhythm, a certain time passing, a certain light feeling, a certain kind of experience of something. Like you said this really beautiful thing when we were talking before about like, you know, that a picture is not like an everyday object. It's not like something that you see every day, that it's like, you know, it's like that it's kind of inviting you to have a different kind of, it registers in your body in a different way. Like, and that like, that, you know, way back when we needed to know the difference between a mastodon that was like way up on a hill and a mastodon that was like really close to us. So there's like this body or this muscle memory that that I really feel in somebody like Mondrian more than I do in Diebenkorn, because like Diebenkorn sort of like, I mean, he kind of annoys me just because I'm from California and there's like a Diebenkorn show up at all times. That was like the only art book we had growing up was Diebenkorn, you know, but like, so then he's like totally in there. It's like, I can't get him out. And I like am so interested in like the musicality and the, you know, you go outside and it's like why we enjoy that so much, like why we enjoy going on a walk so much, or just like we were talking about how painting really makes the world around you very vivid and lively and kind of mysteriously wonderful. And so it's like there's something about the translation back and forth from painting to then just being outside or being inside or being wherever in conversation with somebody that you become very attuned. Like, and I mean that in a sort of musical sense.
But you know, in response to like my mastodon analogy and the inside and outside aspect of things, you said something which I love, which was the scene in Frankenstein when he's looking in from the outside at these humans, right? This family. And since he's like this temporal object, you know, he's a temporal structure because it's made up of all these different things, right? That's the brilliance of that novel. It's really about art, you know. Mm-hmm. But you made this point that, you know, here's this kind of artwork looking in at the human and trying to figure it out, like being a little bit jealous.
Yeah.
But totally. He doesn't even know what jealousy is.
Yeah. And I mean, back again to the sort of like problem of form and formalism. It's somehow, you know, I was thinking about it. I was like, I think I decided that I wanted to be like an abstract painter, like when I was in high school. I realized, you know, and like what gave me that idea. It's like in my high school art class, like we only painted from National Geographics, like for 4 years. That was the project, you know, and there was like acrylic, like 5 colors of acrylic paint in a stack of National Geographics. And I got so tired of that, you know, it was like, so then I saw somebody who was like, you know, selling paintings just like on the street somewhere. And this guy was, you know, painting abstractly. And I thought, well, that will really like show them something different. So then I started just like thinking like, how do you get to that? Like that's like, I felt like the monster, like looking in, like, I just like, but who's going to teach me like how that means anything? Or how do I sort of like get in? How do I like come in from the cold? And so, you know, I've just been kind of learning about that, but I don't find that the world I'm in right now, in terms of, you know, many people I know are super into abstraction. I mean, there are certainly some, but it's always something that I feel a little bit outside of. And so it's like almost like I'm trying to remember something or learn something that like is kind of gone or fleeting or ephemeral. And so in that way, I think again, the paintings are about memory, about trying to, you know, they're nostalgic.
And yeah,
Hopefully not a bad kind of nostalgic.
And this brings up the question of like tradition too, and inheritance, and like, you know, I don't think there's no pure past, right? There's no pure past. So in or I should say in Rosalind Krauss's rereading of Greenberg, she retains some of that form and structure from Greenberg, which is, you know, kind of basically Kantian in terms of categories of experience. She retains that, you know, because she thinks it's an important foil of experience, you know. So it's an interesting argument to kind of rejigger maybe like an agonistic relationship to tradition.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that narrative is only interesting, like juxtaposed to the sort of like Lucy Lepard history also, which is like a different kind of like lived confrontational like experience, right? Like conceptual art sort of was its own dead end in a way. But I think, you know, Lucy Lepard then talks about, I think the need for community, you know, basically, you know, how art only translates sort of like within how art exists like as an event, as a lived event. And, you know, maybe that's where Krauss still sort of like lacks, you know, she's still sort of like trying to uphold this kind of I mean, the high, I guess, you know, the sort of the art experience that doesn't sort of sink to the level of like two people meeting on the street, for example. Whereas I think Lucy Lepard is like, you know, that this art experience can, you know, I love her obsession with public art, you know. And so hopefully, like, in hindsight, you know, we can look back and sort of, I hope that this sort of like balance both of those things, where an object can be something very direct and non-narrative, right? Like I was talking to you about this, that I think a lot of people have narrative inside of the work these days, that they want to put the narrative inside of the work. Like, I think I still want the narrative to be outside of the work, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a narrative of some kind. Then maybe that's just about me as a person, or about, you know, a life lived, but I think that the forgetting about form, the forgetting about medium specificity is, you know, that somehow you have to build a relationship between the two, if that makes sense.
It's just so interesting to hear you talk about the narrative outside the form, because it just makes me think about like the political potentiality of art, like of abstract art.
Yeah.
It's not a pure art. Like it's pointing to the outside a lot. And for me, I mean, I'm an abstract painter too. That's the political aspect of art. It's not illustrating a theme, or it's leaving a lot of stuff open to translation.
Yeah.
So, and that's, you know, translation is an activist language.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the show that I think we both saw recently kind of encapsulates some of the things you're talking about with Lucy Lepard. It's roughly concurrent with when she was writing back then. And that's the show at Karma, the New York painting show, which was all women. But it was, I think it was like between 75 and 80 or something like it was this period And you mentioned it in your essay too, that the show that Katie Siegel and who was the painter? David Reed.
David Reed, I mean, yeah.
It's roughly the same time, High Times, New York, or
High Times, Hard Times, yeah.
High Times, Hard Times, right. So you focus on this period of painting where the possibilities open up, where there are structures that are invented by these artists, but they're not adhered to like a Greenbergian. They're exploding that whole Greenbergian narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a dynamite painting in there by Joan. I hate when this happens, but there's it's an amazing show in terms of, dare I say, illustrating what you're talking about, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the work from that time seems exciting because it seems, I mean, for lack of a better word, like more idiosyncratic, you know, like that there's like these small communities of people where, you know, how does a gesture mean anything? You know, how does somebody like Louise Fishman, who I admire a lot, you know, I love to think about just like the way in which those gestures, like why are they different than, you know, a different person who made big gestures in painting? Like somehow they risk failure in a different way, you know, and for me that's everything. Like that kind of like, they're like a little bit shameful, and that's why they're queer, you know, they're a little bit wrong. And you know, why are they wrong? I mean, I think that's what makes them so right, of course, but it's they don't feel universal. And so it's like you know, formalism just really ends up in this land of it's that purity is such a dead end. And so, but it's like, you can still get like back to Joan's question, how do we get to the place where form is equal to the absence of content? It's like, well, I suppose in a sense it ended up there because that's where it also, you know, it's Greenberg's fault, maybe, you know, that's sort of what the goal was. But what's exciting about it is how full of content it can be without sort of saying, here's my content, like without starting out with content as the thing that's structuring the whole thing. I mean, of course, if you start out with content as structural, like, you know, that's its own form. So I don't want to sort of say anything against that all. It's always about somehow, how do you build poetics? And I somehow came to that through line and weight and color. And maybe that's just the circumstances of my high school class, because we were painting from photographs and I was wanting to be rebellious, you know. I know some people, like, had I probably grown up with abstraction, I probably would have rebelled and then, you know, wanted to paint differently. But so that rebellion was meaningful to me.
Yeah, I mean, one incorporates kind of reaction to tradition. Like, one of the things that's wonderful about that Karma show is, you know, if like you look at that Pat Steer painting that was in there, you can tell that there's a conceptual vibe in that painting, but she's also refuting it simultaneously. She's incorporating it and refuting it. So it's more kind of sincere to time in a way, because she's making a kind of a hybrid temporal structure that both acknowledges like that atmosphere, which I assume would be like, you know, conceptual art, minimalism. She incorporates it into her paintings, but then she does something very lyrical with it. She quotes it, which is a very powerful thing. She quotes it, similar with Howardina Pindell.
Yeah.
And I think there's an early Susan Freecon in there.
Yeah,
which
and
is,
that's a very interesting thing, and that's something that I find myself doing a lot. That quotational thing, whereas it's like you're trying to sort of like you're trying to get some kind of call and response, and it's like because you don't sort of like resonate with that sort of absolution of this mark is just like this absolute pure mark, then how do you sort of get it to sort of mean something in a different way? And so, and in a sense, that's like, it's like you're building a really small community with yourself where you're like, okay, I make this gesture and then I make this gesture again and I make this gesture again. Yeah, and you feel the presence of that. So it's really about this building of presence. And what I love about that, the work in that show is you feel, I mean, the presence and materiality of the painting is just stunning. The surfaces are so rich and messed up and like, funky and thick and that Mary Howman, that early Mary Howman painting is such a beast. And you sort of feel also people's bodies and the presence and sort of like the studio visits and, walking across the street, walking up the street or down the street, the sort of the confrontations with everyday life in that work.
absolutely, yeah, and the body, the body. There's, the painter I'm trying to think of had that big slash going through it.
Oh yeah. Joan Snyder, yeah.
Joan Snyder, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I remembered her first name. That's such a powerful painting. It's like a painting of trauma, but it also works. It really works well as just a painting, like as a physical embodiment. It does both.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think it's necessary for a painting to try to do both, but I was impressed by that ambition,
Yeah, that painting is just incredible. It's just incredible.
It really is. It's just
the showstopper. Yeah, it's so thick and messed up, and you think like, how did she trust herself to keep going with that thing? Because it must have been such a mess at some point.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm like, wow,
Yeah.
you pulled it off, Joan.
Yeah, you really did.
But I mean, I don't know if that show's still up, but I encourage everybody to see that because it really contextualizes this conversation, but also like a larger conversation about what's possible in painting that's not necessarily illustrative or dependent upon illustration of whatever,
Yeah.
What are we looking at now, Fox? This is part of the show,
this is a painting called Your Next Bold Move, which is a title taken from an Ani DeFranco song, actually. I've been listening to Ani DeFranco a lot. The song is about capitalism gunning down democracy, growing up in the age of Reagan ambush. And I think that is this maybe utopian sounding, but there is something to me about abstract painting, which is quite human. It's the scale of it is quite human, where you do really depend on just the sort of visit from some kind of body to sort of stand in front of this little object, which is kind of insignificant. So this painting, I was listening to this song on repeat, and I was the visiting artist at the University of New Mexico recently and spent a lot of time in New Mexico, and that was different because I was in this very different kind of landscape and found that when I was in that bigger landscape, I could let go of even more things that I was kind of hung up on and could kind of like depend more on just like a mark. Anyway, so I worked on this painting for quite some time. It looks pretty simple, but I kept scraping the paint off and putting it back on and scraping the paint off and putting it back on. And eventually I sort of just started enjoying doing that. It's like where I got to the place where I wasn't sort of like trying to finish it. I was just sort of thinking, you enjoy listening to this song. It's very sad. It's about capitalism and sort of like how messed up that is. And it was kind of a catharsis, So, and then at the end, I put this one white mark across the middle of it that I thought ended up like a really great mark. So, and then the song was called Your Next Bold Move. So I thought that was some kind of synchronicity there. And maybe it as a landscape does sort of hold this, you were talking about tone and color. I do think this one's a bit melancholy. Sort of looking at it on a landscape that's a little bit like a sunset or a gloaming.
I love the Ani DiFranco reference because I remember at one point, I don't know, it was the early 90s, so she made her own record label. And she made most of her money in like live performances, like these really dynamic, and just the way she plays guitar is just like really dynamic, really fast. But her career was about being present in order to not be enthralled to record companies. So her medium was directly connected to her political interests. It wasn't, she brought them very close, which I think was a great example for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, she was so important to me growing up. Most young women I know every word to her songs, and it created an enormous sense of camaraderie between us.
A community, yes.
It really did, yeah. And I miss that, I miss that. I yearn for it. I mean, it's so wonderful to talk to somebody like you who's so articulate and like wonderful, like so thoughtful about abstract painting, because that's its own sense of community. And I don't often get that. And it's really difficult to make, I think about it in terms of gesture, like it's really difficult to make a gesture if nobody can read that gesture, like if you can't sort of like, and nobody sort of picks it up and does anything with it, it doesn't really work. So, yeah.
That's a lot of people don't think about it that way. A lot of people don't think about it. And I think that some people would even think that that's not the way to think, because if you're assuming an audience, then somehow like your freedom is kind of qualified somehow. But I know exactly what you're talking about. If you're intending upon communicating, the other side of that is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, I think it's like, what kind of audience do you desire? And somebody like Ani DiFranco desired, like, I mean, she wanted to speak to people directly, just like one-on-one, like that's sort of how it felt with her. It's like she was on stage, but she was really singing really directly to you, making that connection. And so, it's like, does the form kind of speak to you directly, or is it sort of like, making broader strokes? Is it sort of speaking to a more general audience? And I think something, that I think both you and I are involved with, and I mean, we spoke and kind of could communicate right away about things, because, we're part of a smaller audience, I think.
Yeah, Ani DiFranco is kind of like Woody Guthrie. Like she's Woody Guthrie in relation to like the folk tradition, like, and I think that there's something where she incorporated that tradition of speaking to the people. Someone like Billy Bragg or Ani DiFranco did that because they took that seriously. But they were assuming an audience. They were assuming that the audience was there for what they had to say. So it's kind of it's an intentionalization. A lot of abstract painting is an intentionalization,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's cliche, but build a field and they will come kind of thing. Could we go back to painting before that, Chloe? Because you mentioned, that one. Oh no, the one after. No, I'm sorry. This one, 19. I wanted to take a look at this, Fox, because you mentioned Louise Fishman. And we talked about her in terms of the structures that she creates with gesture. She creates these gestural structures. In this painting, I see a repetition of that white line, you know, from the Ani DeFranco inspired painting. But I also see this very rich color tonalities that remind me of, I mean, not in a derivative sense, but they remind me of that same intention in Louise Fishman's work.
Yeah, I always think, I always think about like Louise Fishman, like, I think what's so radical about her work is like that it depends. I mean, there's really not a picture in there. I mean, there is, I mean, just because there always is, like, because you can always see that, but I think it's so reliant on the gesture. It's so indebted to that mark, to the force of that and speed of that mark. And boy, that sounds like so cool to do. And I am like, I'm like, well, at the end of the day, I think I'm still making like pictures, like they're landscapes, they're like places. They have gravity in them, like you can walk into them or something, maybe that I feel like that's sort of like a cop out, but it's like, maybe I also am like, well, I need that gravity because I don't have the same relationship to community,
Right.
I'd like to. It's not for lack of trying, but I mean, maybe it is, I don't know. But yeah.
Well, the great thing about abstraction is, if it's a horizontal line, it implies a landscape.
Yeah.
If it's a vertical line, it implies a person. Like you can't get away from.
One can go either way.
That.
You can turn it over on its side, and it could be vertical too.
Right, but you can't get away from this. The kind of, it goes back to the analogy of the mastodon on the horizon. Like you see the mastodon on the horizon. It's food, but it's not gonna kill you, But if you sense the gestalt of the mastodon like a lot closer, it could either be potential food, but it might kill you,
Mm-hmm.
So those kind of lessons in experience, how we assimilate, like we're very sophisticated, going back eons to how we perceive form. It's not just an illustration. It's like it can be a survival sense, like a latent survival sense. And I think there's an aspect of your work that calls that forth, which I find very powerful.
Yeah, that's so cool that you see that. I definitely feel it in there myself. I mean, sometimes I don't really know exactly what I'm doing, but I have such a strong sense like, oh, this has to move over there to the left, or this is just it. I was thinking about like that a painting kind of has to keep moving, when it gets stuck, when it's still, it's sort of, you don't want to keep looking at it, so you're kind of having to construct this space also that like sort of somehow implies like, and that's what you're saying about phenomenology, that it sort of like implicates the body somehow. And I think maybe I think of that as having movement. I don't know, do you think about it that way? I feel like your paintings have a lot of movement in them.
Yeah, I do. I think about time. I think about behavioral instincts. I don't really think about it. I mean, a lot of times if I go to the studio and I'm not thinking about anything, that's really good, because I'm not thinking about anything. It's like it allows the painting to emerge. Not that I haven't established the structures prior, but because I've established some of the structures prior, it's very important for me not to be thinking about them.
Yeah.
Because I mean, to some extent, you have to access that way of sensing that we probably have forgotten. There's aspects of memory that have to do with tradition and painting, but there's aspects of memory that have to do with remembering those sensory the sensory experiences that give us information in different ways that are just not just a decision between abstraction and representation.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're real.
Yeah.
Because they're embodied.
Right.
They're embedded in our muscle memory.
Absolutely.
I mean, if there's anything you could take to the bank, it's that, right?
Yep.
Not to use a capitalist reference, but.
No, I mean, like, I think about that with this painting actually, which is funny because it has this like, it's like, how like, I guess I was thinking like, those rocks, those big rocks, like out in the Southwest, they sort of like teeter. This painting sort of has that like teetering rock feeling, but I mean, this rock would totally fall off, like that green rectangle would just, so it's suspended. That green shape is very much kind of can rest on the left corner, but then is suspended on the right corner. And that's something that like, only happens that couldn't happen in well, that's something that happens in painting.
Right. There's a sense of kind of like something's going to happen, but then what's interesting for me about this painting is you have like an actual happening on the left, like you have an actual branch collaged on the left. So it's a dialectical relationship between this thing that's already happened, the branch, and this thing that could potentially happen, but never does because it's a painting and it's perpetually never going to happen. That's the intelligence for me of your painting.
That there's this thing that's never going to happen. I like that.
That you're saying it.
Yeah.
In a very elegant way. Like you're setting up, in this particular painting, you're setting up a dialectical relationship between something that's already happened, i.e. the branch. It's an unequivocal object. It instantiates itself. And then the abstract painting, which perpetually is never going to happen. I just love that, That to me is like why I like abstract painting, because those potentialities can happen and, you don't have to listen to like a long lecture about it. It just, your body responds to that.
Right.
I mean, we're both teachers. I have to find ways to express to my students like approximate symmetry and indeterminacy and why that has value,
Yeah.
But I think it has value because it's about creating a temporal structure in time and being aware, like, stepping outside of time to be in time, which schedules don't allow us to do, really. I mean, schedule, the name of your show is Schedule, is just great because it's also an opposition. You can't help but just be reactive to the schedule, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you could do things in between, like take a coffee break or go jogging, which are ways to deal with that. But a schedule is made to be reacted to. And it's no fun. Whereas, like creating temporal structures in painting, it's volitional. And it extends that volitional aspect to the viewer as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be terribly fun.
I mean, your paintings are very engaging in that regard because they have a structure, but they're open at the same time.
Yeah.
I think there's something about acknowledging like temporal structures,
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different ways to do that. I think abstraction is probably one of the most efficient. There's a lot of clarity in abstraction, ironically, right?
Right. Yeah, and I guess that makes me think like in a really kind of simplistic way that, I mean, one of my strategies, I'm not really thinking about it, it's just, and this goes back to just using watercolor, which is like, I love that resists my sort of like it doesn't let me keep working on it. It kind of says like, okay, you've done that's gonna have to be enough. And so you have to just stop. You know, it's like musical chairs. It's like stop. And that's sort of I think one of the ways that I like to work, because so I'm trying to build the structure, but then within that, I'm not trying to finish it. You know, I'm trying to like let that somehow stay open.
Right.
Because I want that quality to sort of be more open than that.
But you said something really important. I think that the abstract gesture needs to be perceived.
Yeah.
And, you know, that goes back to the idea of form. And it's not like I have this attitude of form and everything's going to conform to it.
Right.
Like I have this attitude of form so I can do whatever I want.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or
exactly.
you can do whatever you want with this. So it's very generous in that regard, as opposed to like the typical idea of formalism, which is always perceived historically as repressive because it's just seen through the Greenbergian lens, you know. Problem is time doesn't stop, right?
No.
So luckily time doesn't stop.
No.
So if he was attempting to, you know, make it stop, then he failed. But we have the benefit of his thought structures to work off of, right?
Absolutely. I sort of disagree with him about so much, but then I love reading like that essay on collage, and it's so beautiful. He's so great at looking at paintings.
Yeah, I mean, he's undoubtedly someone who, you know, brought that discussion in American art for sure into a very high level of thought and synthesizing a lot of different things.
Yeah.
I don't know if we should end on Greenberg, but is there anything?
I've been writing this essay, so I've had to have, and you know, he plays a big part of it, so I've gotten used to him.
One of the things I did want to ask, because I'm curious, is the painters that you referenced, the younger painters referenced, Laurel Sparks and R.J. Messenio.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, are there examples in the slideshow? I don't think so.
Of their work? No.
What is it about those two painters, Laurel Sparks and R.J. Messenio, that?
They're just two people I know who are, you know, Laurel like knows a lot about like esoteric forms of magic and math and history and astrology, and kind of brings all of that occult wisdom to an abstract language. And I find that fascinating and very unique and kind of brave. And R.J. Messenio, you know, has just somebody who has described her paintings like, you know, maybe similarly, like, you know, looking out a window, having some kind of frame on something that you're looking at. But just two people who are sort of in my orbit who I've enjoyed kind of like the different way in which we sort of have approached this problem, and just the kind of two people who give me a sense of who do give me a sense of community in terms of like what it means to be working, you know, finding your sort of like own way through building a language, you know, because I think that that's what abstraction is. It's hard work to sort of like, you don't just like set out, you don't get to just like paint the figure, you know, you kind of have to strategize and make plans for like how you're going to divide up the space of the canvas. And so it's nice to know that there are other people kind of like doing the hard work to struggle through that.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not familiar with the work. I'm looking forward to getting to know their work. Are they both abstract artists?
Yeah. And of course, my wife, Molly Zuckerman-Hartung, is someone I talk to all the time, of course, and she's a fabulous abstract painter.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I have to absent this situation right now. And thank you so much to the Rail and to Fox for this like wonderful discussion, and really great to get to know you and your work. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It was so great to talk to you, Tom.
Wow. Thank you so much for that incredible conversation. I'm like over here, like 2 pages deep in my notes, writing down everything you're saying. That was incredible. Thank you for sharing with us, both of you. We do have several questions from the audience, all incredibly thoughtful ones. So we will go into Q&A here. The first question is from Molly. Molly, would you like to be unmuted to ask your question directly? Because if so, you can be. And I'm going to give you that option right now. Okay, no, that's okay. So I will ask Molly's question. Fox, Molly's question was on the topographical nature of the paintings. And here it goes. Is the narrative outside of the process? In Header, for example, the painting, I can bring it up as you talk about it. There are topographies to the paint that differ from the final paint layer. Do those decisions and negations relate to the content of the painting? And let me pull up that painting. There you go.
Yeah. There's in this painting in particular, it's hard to see in the image, but there's like kind of in that blue area. Actually, there's a detail. If you can go to a detail.
Yeah, let me go to the detail. This one?
The one right, but oh, that one you see it, but yeah, go to the one above because that image is less clear. You can see that there's like, and you can see this more in person where like the final kind of form of the painting seems clear and precise, but of course, and maybe this goes back to this concept of building, which I'm always wanting to talk about. My dad is a builder, he's in construction, and like actually Molly was saying this to me before that maybe, and I was disagreeing with her, but I'll agree with her now, which was that, you know, that you learn through process and through trial and error. And I was like thinking about like, when I was a kid, I was always trying to build things. And I built this chair, but I built it like, you know, so that the seat was only like 4 inches deep. And of course, like it wouldn't stand up because it was too narrow. And so then I had to like add a section to the front. And so then it had 6 legs. But my parents were like, you built this chair, you know, the 6-legged chair. And it became this like funny thing. And to this day, I just think like the 6-legged chair was like, you know, the greatest art piece I ever made. So maybe everything in a sense is like a 6-legged chair where, you know, absolutely. So thanks for that question.
Thank you so much for that answer. Thanks for that question, Molly. The next question is from our friend GE. GE, I'm going to allow you to unmute to ask directly.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Hi, Tom, and thank you so much, Fox. And I so loved, we just flashed it for a second there on the screen, but I so loved your connections to Ashbery's work and stuff. So, which really lit me up today. And it kind of triggers my question a little bit. Every stroke on a painting often requires decisions, but whether that decision is correct or might be a delusion a painter indulges in it, maybe for no other reason than to move on to the next stroke, the next placement of shape and color. When did you realize that porous border between decision and delusion, between finality and seeming appearance? And then there's a sort of second part to that about, and as your intention to allow us to then tread that border as well, is to invite us in, it seems to me. Yes.
Yeah. I think it was just now. Honestly, I really do think like we bring it up and we talk about that, and it's like it's so kind of like deep in me that I'm not like, it's like Tom is saying, like you kind of forget things when you're actually in the studio, but then when somebody else like identifies with that or can sort of name it as such, that's so exciting. And it's something, again, which I think that this is sort of how it works, where it's like, you make a bunch of things and then you kind of hang on to some things, and like why you hung on to one thing and not another's like doesn't become clear for another few years, and so I definitely like, I have this like collage that I made with like watercolor, and I remember I like stuck a old receipt on it, like a shopping receipt. And there was just something about that seemed indeterminate. And that's more of a feeling than anything else. And I'm definitely a feeling person, and I try to go with the feeling. I like things to feel lively and open. So I think I try to teach that way too. It's like, I want more questions to be answered, more avenues to open. Like, I don't like things to feel shut down or reified. So yeah. Thanks so much for that very, very thoughtful.
I know it was everywhere, but thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, GE. And thank you for that question, Fox. Answer, Fox. The next question is from Sayak in the audience. Sayak, I'm going to ask you to unmute and you can ask directly.
Hi, Sayak.
Hi, Fox. It was really great to hear you speak and about the thoughts of your process and abstraction. So I have one thing too, because the approach to look at abstract painting was very much about that where I am here right now, rather than because when I see that abstraction, like you put one of the field painting style, my mind goes to like indic more kind of like idealistic landscape, that if I always think like if I take a Mughal painting and get rid of all the leaves and the figures, it will be a painting from someone looking from top, like a field of lands. So that's my question, like to you. So there is a two-way to read approach to read abstract painting here. One is like Greenberg and Rosalind Cross, like ontological and deontological. To my mind, it's to me, it's not. It could be like mystic, or it could be either one or of neither of them. So would you emphasize that, because my understanding of the abstract painting was more like Sufism, or more because they kind of, it's not as an abstraction as a transcendental mode. What even like New Mexico has like really good approach about it. It's not you are escaping away something, you are reacting, you're responding in a arty way. Would you mind to kind of educate me about it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you asked that question, and I know this pertains. Sayak is a student of mine at BU right now, and pertains to the conversations we've been having. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in California. I'm a very spiritual person. I think of myself that way. And, I try to meditate. Maybe I only do it a couple times a week, but what I love about spirituality, I guess, is the same thing I love about abstraction, which is it's very formal, like sitting on a meditation cushion. There's no trick to it. You just sit down and you do it, and actually you reveal yourself, and you can be totally surprised. I mean, you could spend all day talking about yourself, and not learn anything. And in 5 minutes in sitting quietly, you notice that, you're thinking about swimming pools or whatever it is, and you didn't even know that, because it's not the thing that's outward. And so, yeah, I think, and that is most, I see more of the connection, even between something like psychoanalysis and meditation than I see the differences. So, I don't know if that's, you know, I have the, I guess, convenience of being able to misread those things from where I am. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much for that question, Sayak, and thank you for that answer, Fox. The next question's from me. Fox, you you've touched upon this like throughout the conversation with Tom, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit further on the poetry connection in your work and the poetics of it. You talk about building a poetics, but especially with schedules, you reference Ashbury, you reference this idea of the flow chart, which is just such a interesting juxtaposition with the paintings. And I would love to hear you speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's so exciting to get to talk about poetry because I love poetry, but I'm totally just like a fan, Anyway, at one point I memorized a few poems. I love Emily Dickinson, and there was like this Emily Dickinson scholar who said like to really like appreciate Emily Dickinson, you have to memorize the poem. And so then I discovered that I could do that. I could memorize the poem. That was like this amazing, I could recite it for you. I'm not going to, but it's like, and then I started writing poetry for myself. I mean, the first poem I wrote was about my mom, and I was sort of feeling like maybe not that happy with our relationship, and I wrote this poem, and it was such a relief. It was like I really got something out of me, and I just noticed that I think it's really been through poetry that I noticed that words, when somebody asks you to write an artist statement, it's a horrible burden. Nobody wants to do that. Like nobody wants to sort of like shut their practice down and sort of like send it off in a few statements. But when you can think about language as words do not have definite meanings. A word will mean something very different if you put it next to another word. And poetry shows you that. And the great thing about Ashbury is like everything is all up in the air. It's just like this wonderful, buoyant, light feeling. It's like the world is new. Yeah. And flow, I picked up flow chart because I just thought, wow, that's an amazing title for a book, flow chart, because a poem is like a flow chart. So it's so obvious and it's kind of funny. I think that there's just so much life and humor in poetry, and I love to just read a poem because it's an event. It's a lively event. Actually, Molly's mom, she's a great reciter of poems. Anybody who can like recite a poem at a party, it's just or like could sing at the piano, isn't that fantastic? So poetry is just a delight, and I think that Ashbury it's a particular delight,
Incredible. Thank you so much for that answer. And the final question today is going to come from our publisher and artistic director, Phong H. Bowie.
Thank you, Chloe. Nice to hear the conversation between Tom and you there, Fox. I need to go down, see the show ASAP. Probably it's Wednesday. Yeah, because last Saturday I tried to come, but for some reason, the gallery was closed. But yeah, you were talking about somehow Kant came up in your conversation, and of course Kant is the great synthesis of both synthetic proposition and analytic proposition. So that's both together. And I guess what I was trying to think is I need to see your painting in flash, but from the discussion and look at the images on the screen here, there's a certain kind of both directness and humility in the way you mediate the way of geometry. But then geometry seemed to be part of the itinerant process in a way too. And it's very interesting. I thought of this painter, and I wonder, his work well. Helmut Federle, who is a friend of mine, mostly live in Switzerland. Yeah, so it's similar. He used very strange geometry, the center geometry, and the way. So what does geometry to you? I mean, it seems to me that it's melted geometry at times. It's there. It's part of the very beginning of the thought process. But then, as you paint them, they became extremely fragile. They can be melted like butter, you know. So you know, that's the question. I mean, how quickly the image of a certain grid or image appear. There's such distinction between the two, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I can't say anything about Kant. That's over my head. But I was trying to read Stolen Life, the Fred Moten, which is a critique of Kant, I think it is, you know. I mean, I like thinking about like, what is a critique of Kant? Because I don't even really know what Kant is saying. And maybe I feel the same way about the geometry. A student of mine, Noel Africh, is in the audience, and Noel is a great mathematician. So they could tell you more about geometry proper, but I do like to think about it as just finding forms. You know, it's somewhere between, I think geometry is a way at getting at, I think about it in terms of narrative. It's a way of getting at narrative. But a narrative structure that holds time through simultaneity rather than through one thing leads to the next. And I mean, that's such an abstract thing to say, but I do notice that I like to have hard edges and shapes in my paintings because they seem to hold time in a different way than something that's just all over. Because then I think you try to read the painting, like in the way you try to read a Persian miniature painting, because different things happen in different quadrants in different parts of the picture. And so when you set up those like those balances and those relationships, I think the body kind of feels its way into that and can understand that there's something unfolding. And maybe that thing that's unfolding isn't linear narrative in the way that we think about it, but it's I don't know, it's like we keep going around the sun. It's like, is that a narrative? It's also very consistent. It's just like we keep doing it just again and again. The leaves fall off and the leaves come back, and the leaves fall off and the leaves come back. And that's not so much narrative as event. So maybe I think of the geometry as a way to somehow try to structure an event, try to create an event of some kind. And that event is just balance of some kind. Yeah.
Well, which is a temporal structure, as you and Tom was talking earlier. Well, that's really good. Well, just think of Emily Dickinson. I don't remember the whole poem, but there's one that I think I remember maybe 4 lines. Hope is the thing with feathers. I think that's maybe the most fitting one. Hope is the feathers that perks in the soul and sing the tune without words and never stop at all. Maybe it's continuing, you know? So that's the parts that I need to come ASAP to see the show this Wednesday. So thank you so much and congratulations on the beautiful talk and the show. I can't wait to see it. And I urge you to go see the show too. It unveiled till what, Fox? When exactly?
Next weekend, Saturday is the last day.
Okay, cool. So we better hurry ourselves to get there. Thank you so much. And
thank you so much.
Thank you, Fox. Back to you ASAP there, Chloe.
Thank you so much for that question, Fong, and thank you for that answer, Fox. And thank you again so much for this conversation, which was an absolute pleasure and extremely lovely to watch. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Tatiana Borie, to the stage. Tatiana Borie is a poet and student of beautification rituals based in New York City. They are currently synthesizing death, object cathexis, and how to achieve the perfect 90s blowout. They graduated from Pratt Institute in 2020 with a BFA in Critical and Visual Studies and are now attending beauty school. Welcome, Tatiana.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. Thank you so much to Fox and Tom and everyone at the Rail. Fox, I loved hearing what you've had to say about community and feelings of isolation within the abstract sect, but I felt when hearing you speak that your work is really generous and you really invited us into your process, which, yeah, I love to hear. It was awesome. I guess when oh, yeah. So when I was choosing work for today, I was thinking a lot about my own relationship to landscape and like through childhood, what I was taught from my caregivers. I grew up in rural Vermont, so I'm like very directly into landscape. So yeah, I'm starting with a poem that kind of talks to the process of like childhood delusion and figuring out the world through imagination. Then kind of going into the process of landscape and love in the second poem. And then the third kind of acts as a meditation. So feel free to breathe and stretch along with it physically if you want to. So yeah, the first one is called Adult in the Room. Adult in the room. What were your childhood delusions? Mine was falsified photosynthesis. Back on frozen grass, booted feet to sky. I never learned how to build a birch bark canoe. Mine was falsified photosynthesis. We were the Bluebell girls. I never learned how to build a birch bark canoe. Mother told me I'd someday grow old. We were the Bluebell girls. Aren't 8-year-olds territorial? Mother told me they'd someday grow old. She didn't show me the reality of death. Aren't 8-year-olds territorial? While I was your teacher. She didn't show me the reality of death. Adult in the room. While I was your teacher, what were your childhood delusions? Adult in the room. Back on frozen grass, booted feet to sky. 2. Immaculate Heart. In my periphery, I glimpsed the lover, holding a hammer, her form remaining fuzzy and warped through the glass, growing larger as she approaches me. She taps, timid. She knows stained glass takes years of love and care to bloom into fruition. She taps. Cracks begin to meander about the indigo. She taps, fingertips. The window pane glows. I flutter, buzz. She taps. Fault lines sever burnt sienna, alizarin crimson. Spread. The earth will be my vessel, or perhaps I will be the vessel for more earth, or perhaps the opposite. Spread of insides and outsides. Animals and dirt act as surrogate. Spread of insides and outsides, carrying me both close and away, pulling. I will spread my fingers and toes wide, placing each nerve into the dirt, nestling and rearranging the furniture of my limbs. Call this holy. Breathe in, fill the belly. Breathe out, sink. 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 Thank you, everyone.
Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you so much, Tatiana. That was really, really wonderful. And And thank you again, Fox, and thank you, Tom, and thank you to everyone at Below Grand in helping prepare for today's event. Thank you to the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making daily conversations like this one possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You can view today's event and our full archive on our YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like here on our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Jesse Reeves and Julia Trotta on the occasion of At the Well at Bridget Donahue in New York. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by Anessa Gale. And you can now turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.